first. I'm thinking of this as a rough draft. So, yeah, let's just get started. And there's some reading here, so. Elizabeth, there should be sound coming through. I did. But well, maybe the people on Zoom can hear. No. But you all can't hear it.
We can hear you only, but not the presentation. So let's come back in.
Sorry, y'all. I worked really hard on that first part, and I just wish. No, but there's music to it. There's so I want you to hear the sound of it. Well, there's. It's from my computer. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you. Yeah, so here we are in the soulscape. Most of you know me as Luke Colacello, but here in the soulscape, I am known as Yeshayahu, and so this is my avatar for the evening. I hope you can see the resemblance. And so this is a journey into the soulscape. It's a combination of my art and music and poetry, but ultimately the underlying point here is to try to help us understand the soul and the nature of the soul, and particularly through a Kabbalistic lens. So, the Hebrew, chemistry, and the soul manifold. So that's the name of the presentation. And so how am I connected to each one of these things? So Hebrew, the first part of this. As a 10-year-old Gentile, I started teaching myself Hebrew. I was very enamored the first time I heard a Hebrew spoken, and I became obsessed with the idea that I needed to learn Hebrew. And so this picture here is actually from the first Hebrew book I ever bought myself. Learn Hebrew in 10 minutes a day. And I still have it, and so I took this picture. I think it's a wonderful artifact. I like this particularly because if you pay close attention, 10-year-old Gentile Luke refused to do the stick figure Hebrew letters that are in blue. And so with my individual single needle pencil, I tried to draw all the Hebrew letters like they were ink drawings. So I've been called by the Hebrew letters from a young age. In terms of chemistry, I received a bachelor's in chemistry and then a master's from the Colorado School of Mines in material science, but I really did chemical research. And so the images up here are from my master's thesis. I studied a group of materials called silicon clathrates, which are these cage materials that have big spaces around them and can hold smaller molecules inside those spaces. And I was testing them or studying them from a theoretical point of view. I did quantum mechanical computations to see if these materials would be viable as renewable energy materials. And so that's my chemistry background. And then this past year, I started teaching chemistry at the Community College of Denver. So been really getting back into my chemistry. And then the last piece here, the soul manifold. When I started my conversion journey in 2018, I came with a lot of opening up in a way that I had never felt before. And it really brought me back to my art and my music. And I was in grad school at that point, it was very rational-minded and science-oriented. And my conversion to Judaism really opened a lot of things up. And then in 2021, I had the opportunity to start teaching as an adjunct instructor at the Kabbalic experience. Rabbi Jamie invited me to do a tarot and Kabbalah class with him. And so ever since, I've been teaching classes there at the Kabbalah experience. And so the tree of life here is represented. And so it's really a synthesis of these things that I've been learning and studying over the years. So what is the soulscape? So this is a little representation that I have of the soulscape, and we'll be going into some of these things. For me, when I say soulscape, I'm really thinking about the realm beyond this physical realm. So you might call it the spirit realm, or the dark realm, however you describe it. But that's really what I'm trying to speak to. In Kabbalah, you can connect this realm to Ein Sof, which is this endless expanse. And I imagine it as an endless expanse of white light, just blinding light. And so actually to see what we're seeing right now, you actually have to apply a metaphysical filter, if you might, to filter out the background noise of the soulscape and reveal some of these figures in here. And so you'll see what I call soul forms. Laser pointer. So soul forms, and then the Hebrew letters sort of popping in and out of existence, similar to that description that we got from Pinhas of Koretz. So I'm not going to be going in the order that I was of Hebrew, chemistry, soul, manifold. I'm going to be going chemistry, soul, manifold, Hebrew. And so here's chemistry, but they're all entwined. So that quote that I opened with in the video, that description, the Holy Torah was in its original form an incoherent jumble of letters. The letters were jumbled until a certain event occurred, then the letters combined to describe the event that took place. When I first encountered this, I could not help but think this sounds exactly like what it means for a wave function to collapse. And so I'm going to introduce some sciencey chemistry terms if you don't know them. So the wave function is a mathematical function that describes all of the measurable information regarding a quantum particle or system. A wave function also describes the probability of an individual particle being in a given quantum state. So we can think of it as this set of, a probabilistic set of states. But it's not an individual state, it's sort of existing as a cloud of possibilities. This is connected to Schrodinger's equation, which is used to extract the information out of the wave functions themselves. And this graphic sort of is illustrating this idea of what a wave function is. You can sort of visualize it in that way. And so a couple of other ideas when we're really thinking about quantum mechanics and trying to connect it to more of these esoteric traditions. So one that you might have heard of, the wave-particle duality. So this speaks to the notion that the fundamental particles are not just particles, but they also exist as waves. So they're both waves and particles at the same time. And it just depends on how you're viewing them or treating them in the moment. And then what's also known as the superposition of states. So as a waveform, quantum particles exist in multiple different states simultaneously. And so the famous example of sort of describing this is what we call the Schrodinger's cat experiment. It's a thought experiment in which a cat is put in a box. It's a really cruel thought experiment if you think about it. But a cat is put in a box with a radioactive material and a Geiger counter. And then a lid is put on the box. If the radioactive material decays, it's going to cause the Geiger counter to go off and break a vial of poison and kill the cat. If the material does not decay, the cat remains alive. Before we can open the box back up, because radioactive decay is a quantum process, the states of being decayed and not decayed exist simultaneously in a superposition until the act of opening up the box and observing what is happening. Only then will the wave function collapse into one of those two states. So we go from being superpositioned of both dead and alive cat to dead or alive. So those are all sort of these quantum ideas that are, I think, connect a lot to Kabbalah. On the right here, this figure is just representing electrons around the nucleus of an atom, a hydrogen atom specifically. And so these clouds are where electrons are orbitals of electron probability. So the electron exists in these clouds, but until we measure it, we can't actually speak to where it is or how fast it is going. And before that point, all of the electrons are existing in multiple states at once. So going back to this quote, I wrote something else up that I feel like just mirrors it. So a quantum particle that is described by the wave function exists as a field of probability, occupying a superposition of states until the moment that is it observed or measured, then it collapses into a single state. So hopefully you see the parallels there as well now. And so encountering that really gave me a lot of ideas about and sort of helped me start putting together this PowerPoint. So the soul manifold, what is that referring to? So there's a few pieces. So the soul manifold is what I ended up naming a Substack that I've just started. And so it's this project that I'm doing, sort of this presentation, a set of ideas and postulates and intuitions regarding the nature of the soul and the soulscape, visualized through building analogies to science, art, and spirituality, so that we have so that we can more consciously and intentionally fashion our soul's purposes in this lifetime. As a concept, so this idea, the manifold, so it's actually a term from mathematics. It's a term in a couple of different areas, but in mathematics, a manifold is used to represent what we call a non-Euclidean geometry. That is, any sort of curved object or curved space whose global properties can vary very widely. But if we were to zero in on a local point in that manifold, we could understand its properties using Euclidean geometry. So what does that mean? Just to back up a little bit. So Euclidean geometry is essentially flat space. So if you look at it, just a normal piece of grid graph paper, that we would call Euclidean space. Things translate through Euclidean space in the same way regardless of where it is in that space. So what do I mean by that? So take a particle, this red particle, and if I were to move it up 1 unit and to the right 1 unit, it's going to form the same distance between the start point to the end point, which is the square root of 2 for units, for 1 unit. And so anywhere in Euclidean space, we can move that particle that same distance, and it's always going to move and translate the same way. Non-Euclidean space, a great example is our globe, how we represent the Earth using longitude and latitude lines. When we overlay those onto a curved surface, we get this phenomenon where all the units are not the same, right? They distort as we get closer and closer to the poles and further away from the equator. So in a non-Euclidean space, if I were to try to move 1 unit up and 1 to the right, it will change that distance. It won't be the square root of 2. It's going to be different depending on where I am on the globe. And so that is a non-Euclidean space, something that we can't understand unless we start zooming it in. So with the globe, right, we are able to zoom in and make maps of our localities, right, evergreen map, because we make the assumption, even though the whole planet is curved, it's so large that we can approximate where we live as a flat surface. And so a non-Euclidean geometry would also be the example of black holes, where things get really weird, and that's partly why. It's because it's a non-Euclidean space. And so I have mapped this concept to what I call the soul form, which is, in my mind, a metaphysical object that can't be described in its totality. The soul, our souls, we can't understand them fully, but we can zoom in on aspects of it and understand small parts of it. And so that's sort of the underlying metaphor that I'm working with when I talk about the soul manifold. So, how do we apply this to our souls? So from the Kabbalistic perspective, the soul is broken up into sort of 5 layers. Broken up is probably not the right terminology, since they all sort of, in my mind, kind of bleed into one another. But we represent those with nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and yechida, so the 5 layers of the soul. And when we go from nefesh to yechida, we're really thinking about going from the outermost aspect of our soul, which is sort of connect with our physical reality, our physical bodies, and we're going deeper and deeper inward to more of the divine spark. So that's how I imagine neshama, sort of this divine spark that is being poured into us from the soulscape, from the divine realm. We also, in Kabbalah, map the soul using this, what we call the tree of life. And so we see already a map of the soul. So this is a very common practice for people to make maps of the soul. We can't understand the full entirety of the soul, so we break it up into objects that we can understand to some respect. And so the tree of life is made up of 22 Hebrew letters and the 10 Sephirot. And so I'm going to be using throughout this evening this first soul form here as sort of a case study, if you might, as you might say. But so when looking at the anatomy of the soul from the Kabbalistic perspective, so going back to the tree of life, can't go back, which is so crazy. There's sort of the middle axis, the middle pathway, and then the right and the left pathways. And so I've sort of centered the soul forms around that middle center point. And so you can see the center point and then these sort of obtrusions coming off of the soul that I call wells. And same thing with this red soul form. This is a doodle that I'm very interested in trying to capture how we might visualize the soul. And so this is taking into account more of those layers, especially the first three. So I sort of have this outer layer, which is sort of the circle, the physical layer. Undulating sort of in and out of the physical layer is what I would call the ruach, which is more of the intermediary between the nefesh and the neshama. And at the very core, the brightest part of it is the neshama, which is directly being connected to this concept of Ein Sof, or the divine potential. So the soul form is a playful rendering of how I conceptualize the soul. It's a metaphysical object, and it occupies a non-Euclidean geometry. Like a quantum particle, it also represents a field of probabilities and potentialities. And so, again, I invite you to start thinking about your own soul. That's the point here, right? And reflecting on your potentialities, your wells, the things that you're good at, or the things that you fall into, whatever it might be. And so just as in mathematics, you can zero in on a manifold and chart its local regions, we can do the same with the soul. And so that's what I call metadynamic wells. So this is pulling from a concept in chemistry of the potential energy well, or the thermodynamic well, in which is essentially an energetic well in which particles fall into to become into their most stable state. So they tend to fall into these wells to become stable. I think as individuals, as human beings, we have our own wells that we fall into. And so that's sort of the connection that I have here. I have included the Hebrew letter ayin here because it speaks to wells. The ayin the letter is derived from the word for eye, but also the word for well, which I think is very fitting for the eyes. And then the soul form, as you can see, so these obtrusions are representing these wells that we can fall into. So how do we start describing the wells that we have, that our personal souls can fall into? And so I call these soul functions. So just like in math, right, we have geometric spaces and physical relationships are described by functions, mathematical equations. And functions are represented by a set of variables that define a coordinate system. We can change the coordinate system without changing what the function describes. So for example, the wave function that we talked about earlier can be described using Cartesian coordinates, which is our normal x, y, and z, or spherical coordinates, which because the quantum realm sort of acts in spherical shapes, the spherical coordinates come in very handy. But they are both describing the same thing, even though we've changed the variables and the context in which we are describing the function. And so we can do the same with our souls. So for example, we could think about our soul as being a function of the astrological signs. So we can start pulling in these different traditions or systems that we use to make sense of our souls. So the birth chart, it is a representation of potential energy wells. Our planetary bodies represent spaces that we fall into over and over. And so we could say that I could describe my soul as a function of the different planetary objects in our solar system. And so I actually made, this is the logo for the soul manifold up here, which is a function of Pluto and Mercury, those two planets. And that's because those two planets are dominant in my birth chart. So in a lot of ways, I see myself as a function of Pluto and Mercury and those energies. But we can also do other systems, right? We can think of our soul as a function of the 22 Hebrew letters and the 10 Sephirot, and start thinking about those wells. Or, as we do in Musar, we can attribute our soul function to the 13 divine attributes, or the midot, the Jewish ethical practices. And so I'm going to use that last one. So what is your soul a function of, is one question you can think, ask of yourself, and what coordinate systems are you using? And so here's a little example using the 13 midot, and I'll offer myself up in this example. So here I'm showing the 3 of the midot of Jewish ethical practices, so humility, patience, and order, anava, savladnut, and seder. So I intentionally circled anava and seder on sort of the larger protrusions. I feel like those are midot that I've developed or have always sort of fallen into, not always in the good ways, right? Each midot brings with it sort of a positive and negative aspect to itself. So for anava, for example, like sitting up here and getting the courage to do this, I mean, it took a lot of energy the last few weeks, a lot of internal dialogues of, I shouldn't do this. No, I should, but here I am. Seder, I've always been very interested in order and numbers and how things fill in space. Graphic design, I feel like, falls into order. But then savladnut, patience, is something I still need to practice on. It's a little underdeveloped, as you might have seen earlier. Okay. Somewhere I was supposed to do a song. So going back to Wells. So there's a couple of musical pieces here, and especially during the music, I invite you to draw. But thinking about the wells that we fall into, this was a song that I had worked on that came to me sort of out of a relationship or a friendship. But I found that in it, when I started playing it, it triggered something else, and I tripped in. I fell into a well. And I use the term trip. That's something that my mother talks about. She's an acting coach and a director. And so in improv, we talk about tripping into our emotions. And so this song sort of tripped me from sort of the physical realm into a description of the soul realm. I don't know if people online are going to hear the guitar, but hopefully. Saw you standing there, sunlight scattered in your hair. I saw you standing there, shadow across your face. You showed me what's in my heart, fragments of shattered art. Showed me what's in my heart, something I hid away, and we are one, moon and stars and sun, the wind along the plains, fire, spirit, flame. So why, oh why do I run? Why, oh why do we run? Deep in the forest of the divine, rivers are flowing between your soul and mine. Flowers are blooming from fractals of love. Light is raining from clouds above. Letters and numbers and stories unfold. All and none will ever be told. You and I are one and the same. All this suffering is such a shame. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. I saw you standing there, sunlight scattered in your hair. I saw you standing there, your shadow across your face. Thank you. I forgot that. Yeah, if you ever feel compelled to clap, I prefer the hand wave, the sign language clap. Thank you. Okay, so going back, I knew I'd missed something. And so that brings us to some Hebrew. And so before I get into the Hebrew, just a note on quantum field theory. So quantum field theory is sort of is more of a quantum physics concept. And it looks at the fundamental particles of the universe. Here's an interesting little correspondence. There are 12 fundamental particles. So corresponds to a lot of different 12s, 12 astrological signs, 12 months of the year, 12 simple letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And so that's this outer ring. But when you talk about quantum field theory, or when physicists talk about it, this theory describes reality as emerging not from finite pinpoint particles, but from infinite fields that permeate everything in space. Very hard to conceptualize because it's permeating in every direction and like through everything. And then the way that material reality arises is actually from excitations in the field, little pockets of vibrational energy that you can sort of imagine as these little waves. And so these bumps here sort of traveling through space. And from those emerge our particles and then our material reality. And so when I started learning about quantum field theory, started watching a lot of YouTube videos, I started thinking about the Hebrew letters, which are mystical entities. Each one has a different vibrational signature. And with different vibrational signatures come different attributes. The Hebrew letters are also connected to numbers, and so they're intimately entwined. And so I started working on tessellating my Hebrew letter art in space to make these fields. Could someone grab me that notebook? Both those notebooks over there? Thank you. So here we have the ayin field. This is the Hebrew letter ayin, which is that well that we talked about earlier. And then for each of these, I've actually, I've written poetry for each one of the letters, sort of inspired by their energies and inspired by the words. I'm just going to read little bits of each poem for these. So for ayin, wells upon wells upon wells. All you are wells. More than you will ever know. That is what it means to be unconscious. Wells so deep they span lifetimes, generations. Inherited through soul, conferred through blood, you fall into them over and over, and you don't even know it. You are not free. Wells of sadness, filled with tears, mine and yours. Wells of rage, filled with flames, mine and yours. Here's the hay field, the Hebrew letter hay. In the space between contraction and expansion lives our life breath hay. And when the full moon enters Lamed in the first month of spring, we sing Hallel, praises, into the night for the miracle of liberation. But I have not yet to rejoice. I am still crying out to Adonai like our ancestors, still in search of my voice, the silent child, but not by choice. The Nun field, the Hebrew letter Nun. O Nun, spirit of fish and scorpion, steward of sea and land, keeper of the waters of life, tell me, where are our prophets now as bombs fall between heaven and earth, ascending and descending instead of angels? Where is the promise of a Shabbat eternal, warm and quiet. This is not a dream. They cry out in waves of pain. Do you hear them? Feel them? Divine vibrations laid low by destructive interference. There is no reception there, and I hide from my voice and theirs because sometimes the darkness is too hard to bear. And then the Aleph field, the first Hebrew letter of the alphabet, representing silence, as Rabbi shared with us earlier. Diffracted in reciprocal space, I am fragmented, scattered shards left entirely whole, emanating from some divine consciousness without end. And here you are shrouded in mortality, a finite figment of an infinite imagination, body ensouled, 2 hands and a spine. 1,000 in one we are contained, hidden, nodal, void, space and time collapsing in on themselves, will, joy, faith. And there we meet, tunneling along the crystal lattice of our soul, turned inwardly, glimpsing truth without end. Okay, and so before I leave you all tonight, one last thing. So one other song. So the final thought I have for the evening, I don't know where I am, I don't know where I'm going, I don't know where I am, I don't know where I'm going, you don't know where you are, you don't know where you're going, you don't know where you are, you don't know where you're going, Adonai, 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 where am I, Adonai, 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 waiting in the dark, and there I could not see the place that I was meant to know. Eyes were closed, heart was closed, mind was closed. Then I went walking down the path, and there I found a tree, and she bore a seed of light. Where am I going? Where am I going? Where am I going now? Where am I going? Where am I going? Where am I going now? Okay, and with that, I thank you all. Toda Rabba. Thank you for joining me in the spirit, in the soulscape. And I'm just seeing if I have anything else written here. Yes, and so may we each continue to find the divine spark and light, not only in ourselves, but in other people as well. And if you are interested in more of what I'm doing, you can go to the soulmanifold.substack.com. Or if you're interested in any custom Hebrew art or handmade kippot, yarmulkes, you can reach out to me. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, and I welcome some questions if people have questions, of course. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if maybe I'll stop sharing. Yeah, Jenny.
So you were talking about systems that might sort of speak to our souls, or sort of we might fall into different sorts of wells of different systems.
Yeah.
What do you? So and I know you follow the astrological, but what about each of us? How would we address?
Yeah, I mean, that was partly the question that I was asking you all. What are your coordinate systems? What are the systems that you use to sort of make sense of your life? So other systems, the major arcana and the tarot could be a system that maps to the soul and that you use to help understand. The Enneagram could be a system, right? Sort of any system that helps us articulate, right? All those systems are really trying to help us articulate what exactly, why, who I am, the way I am, why I'm this way, right? And so for me, those are the physical observations that we can make about ourselves that then we can tie back to our soul nature. So having an understanding of those parts of ourselves helps us maybe reflect on, an essence of the wells that I came into this world with, right? When Alan Marinis was here, I asked him a question because he has a very attuned sense of the soul as well, and I really liked hearing his description. So I asked him, in your notion, like, do we come into the world with a certain set of things, right? Each one of us, and he said, well, you clearly don't have any children, and so, which is a true statement. But when you observe kids, like there is these like core aspects of people. Right, for me, Hebrew, like this weird affinity towards Judaism from a very young age, I feel like that was a well that I came into this lifetime with. Yeah.
So potentially bringing with us attributes from previous incarnations.
Oh yeah, I personally really believe in reincarnation cycles, and so that part of our current lifetime is, learning from past lifetimes or trying to get out of wells from past lifetimes.
Do you ever think about the self as like a perturbation in the quantum field of the soul state or souls?
The self. Oh yeah.
Thinking about the dissolution of the self.
Yeah.
Into the quantum void.
No, repeat that, Josh.
Yeah, do you ever think about the self as being like a vibration or perturbation or a particle in the quantum field theory of souls?
Yeah, well, so in the Kabbalistic perspective, one of the pieces that I don't think necessarily all traditions sort of treats the animating life force that we have, the soul is intimately imbued in our physical selves at the nefesh level, and it is said that when someone passes away, someone dies, that a little aspect of their soul remains in the physical part of the body. So I do feel like we can disintegrate our physical selves a little bit. Yeah, that goes towards your question. Yeah. And if you have questions online, I welcome you to type them in. But also no pressure if there's no other questions.
So this may sound like a strange question, but so the soul is imbued with us, and yet I get the impression that it's everywhere.
Yeah, so I imagine the soul realm, the spirit realm, obviously exists in a different realm than us. It's very hard to speak of, right? And that's partly why I've captured a lot of this in artistic expressions, because I feel like through art we can point at some of these things a little easier. so the way I imagine the soul realm, I mean, first of all, the soul realm doesn't obey our physics in any way. I don't imagine it has the same spatial aspects. So, for me, it really is that sort of sea of bright light. In that in the soul realm, everyone's soul is immersed in that bright light. I do feel like there's some way that does distinguish us from the background divine energy, right? Each one of our individual souls that manifests. So there is some sort of layer, but that's something I'm still thinking about and have been thinking about, yeah. Because it's a really hard thing to try to capture what the soul realm would look like. And again, obviously, we will never really know unless we ascend somehow. Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Hello,
Oh, yes.
Mom.
So if you haven't, I brought my Hebrew letters here and some art. So all 22 Hebrew letters, I think I didn't count them, are on the wall. And if you do want to buy a handmade yarmulke, I have some back there as well. So thank you, Rabbi.
Luke.
Sun sign is a Virgo, and I'm a Scorpio rising. But my Pluto sits on the rising sign, which is the ruler of Scorpio rising. So I have a lot of intense Plutonic energy. That the Virgo energy has a hard time with.
Can you give us,
Luke,
this
can
is
you
Rabbi
hear me?
Jamie. Hi, friends. Can you give us an example of how you learned about yourself from, let's say, your Hebrew name? Like how the letters created a gateway to self-exploration?
Yeah. Yeah, so my Hebrew name is Yeshayahu. And I sort of got that name from a dream I had. In revisiting my name over time, right? So I got that name, but I have looked at the Hebrew letters. So it starts with a yud, as a lot of Hebrew names do. I wear a necklace with a yud on it every day that I got from my uncle John Fine, who I think is online. But yud is the Godhead, right? We conceptualize the tree of life being mapped to yud hey vav hey. The unpronounceable name of God, and so Yud is sort of the Godhead of that. And it's the divine contraction. It's the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And so also sort of speaks to humility, maybe, being small like that. The other one that I've really, because I've been doing a lot of work with ayin, the well, Yeshayahu has an ayin sort of in the middle of it. So I have been really thinking about that well, and the wells, because I feel like I have a lot of wells that I fall into. And the work, one of the things I didn't mention, part of the work here is also for myself. I'm trying to do this to remind myself of that last note, that we are all divine sparks of energy, and beautiful shining lights, because I forget it about myself all the time. But I also have been, I think maybe a lot of us can relate, it's really hard in the world right now to continue to see that divine spark in other people, especially the ones that we don't agree with. And so, yeah, ayin definitely something I have been working with a lot.
Yeah, just when we're ready to close, we can count the Omer and say Kaddish.
Awesome, yeah.
Are you another question?
One brief question. Okay, so Luke, we were talking earlier about seeing into sort of, as we stand on maybe potentially a precipice of new ways to do things, new ways to worship, new ways to form community. So do you have any suggestions about how the Hebrew alphabet, or what letters we could, if they all fell out in the beginning and created the universe or whatever, how might they also now fall out and lead us to new and exciting pathways?
Is that more of a collective question, or?
Collective, for
for the collective, for the collective. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, I think. Well, for finding them, for finding a Hebrew letter for yourself, which I think is a worthwhile practice if that's something that calls to you. An easy place is to start with names. So whether you have a Hebrew name or not, right, there's always a corresponding letter to English names usually. So you can find that letter and just start playing with its energies. I have a lot of books that talk about sort of the metaphysical energies of each Hebrew letter. And the other part about the Hebrew letters is that oftentimes the Hebrew letters are actually made up of other Hebrew letters themselves. And so there's just these layers of metaphors and associations that each letter has. So it's really, I think, an exploration. So I highly recommend exploring some Hebrew letters. My sort of fields, right, I think of them also as meditation devices, Shaviti, right? So if you want to have a field, I'm happy to send digital copies, and then you get lost in some of them and see where it takes you.
Well, thank you, Luke,
Yes,
so much.
thank you all. Thank you on Zoom. Thanks for covering 4 time zones, or 3 time zones.
Yeah, then the fields of the letters, having like a set of 4 create a whole different geometry. It's really powerful and very cool. All right, well, welcome. So do you want to say a word about the Omer before we count her?
Sure, yeah. So we are entering the last day of the Omer. So this is the counting that we do, 49 days between Passover and the holiday Shavuot. And really is, I mean, at a Kabbalistic level, is taking us through the Sephirot of the Tree of Life. So that's sort of the metaphysical, spiritual side of things. But also just, the act of counting as someone who likes numbers. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah, so we'll start with a blessing for the counting of the Omer, then we'll do the actual counting. You can repeat after me in the Hebrew and then English, and then with your indulgence, we'll say the Mourner's Kaddish also. And just one, moving tonight from the 48th day to the day after the 48th day, moves from Yesod of Malchut, the lower 2 or outer 2 Sfirot, to Malchut of Malchut, which is the letter Tav, which is the symbol for letters, symbols. It's a symbol that symbolizes symbols, and just a powerful reminder of how we get there through symbols and through the letters. They become the doorways and to manifest the manifold. All right, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al Sfirat HaOmer. Hayom Tisha V'Arba'im Yom Shehem Shiva Shavuot. Tonight begins the 49th day of the Omer, making a full 7 weeks. That's completion of the mitzvot from Leviticus of counting all of the complete 7 weeks. So we've done it here with the 7 weeks, and there's this image of when someone dies, God becomes incomplete. And one teaching I read was that when we say the Kaddish, we're trying to boost God back up, like fill that empty space in God. I love that idea. So there's a big space where my dad left in God, so need the boost. Anyone else saying Kaddish or want to name somebody for dedicating this? Yeah. What's her name? Anid Sims. Okay. So if you're saying Kaddish, you can stand with me. You can stand if you like to stand, for those who don't have someone to say it for them. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah. Be'amad yivrach chirutei v'yamlich malchutei. B'chayechon u'b'yomechon u'v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael ba'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru. Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam u'lomei amaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shemei d'kudsha b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata da'amiran be'alma v'imru. Amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav. Hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru. Amen. May the source of wholeness, who gifted us with this evening of learning and creative expression, grant comfort to all in mourning and peace to us and to Israel and to all her neighbors and all who dwell on earth. And let us say, Amen. Amen. Yisher koach, Luke, and thank you, friends on Zoom, for joining us and supporting this and making our minyan. We'll say Chag Sameach, Happy Shavuot, and hope to see you again soon and have a fruitful first harvest as we enter into the season of harvest. Chag Sameach.
Smeach.